Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Like Stars podcast with me, your host, Pete Goodman. Glad you chose to join. I know over the past few months I've been slacking off a little bit and getting these episodes out every other week like I want to. A lot of that's just been vacation, different things. As I've mentioned many times, I'm right near the end of trying to finish this book, and so there's been a ton of editing, all that kind of stuff. No excuses, but I'm going to try to get into a better rhythm here moving forward. Today on this episode is actually a very special, never been done before in the Like Stars thing. I actually have a guest that's going to join me for a bit of a conversation, really probably just more direct questions. We'll get into that in a minute, but it's going to be unique and we'll try something new. So stick with me. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Also, let you know, like I mentioned, I've mentioned this a few times, but I want to bring it up again. I'm just about done with my New Testament course. So if you are interested in walking through the New Testament with me, I have 2 books of the Bible left I have to finish, and then I'm going to release that. It's coming very soon. It'll be free, available on my podcast network, on my YouTube, all that stuff. So check that out when it comes out. Little short videos of every book of the New Testament. And yeah, I'm probably about 2 months away from the Like Stars book finally getting done and coming out. I'm excited about that. So it's going to be good. As always, please, if you have any comments, any questions you want to share or anything like that, leave me a comment on Instagram, Facebook, any of those things. You can find me on social media there. You can also email me, pete@risechurch.com. If you haven't had a chance to, please like or leave a comment or review on the podcast itself. So helpful. I want to hear from you, and it just helps spread it around more. So love you to do that. And if you have anyone in your life that you want to share it with, man, please do. Pass it around. The more people that find it, the better. Now, let me dive in. No funny sponsors today. We're just going to dive right into it. A few episodes earlier, I made a comment talking about the whole, like, hey, if you have a question, email me. And I actually said, if you are someone that maybe lives in the San Diego area and you just literally want to talk to me, reach out to me, buy me a burrito, and we can just sit and chat. Well, a few people have actually taken me up on that. The offer is still wide open. I love burritos. But one specific person not only took me up on it, we've met 3 times now. And every time we do, he brings just a list of questions. And we've sat at restaurants for a couple hours sometimes, just talking, working through some of the questions he has about the Bible. And he reached out to me and said, can we do it again? And we were going to meet today, actually, when I was filming this podcast. And we were going to get lunch and talk. And I just thought, hey, why not just make that the podcast? Why don't you just come on? I'll add another mic and you can answer the questions in real time. Now, I want to say that for the record, not only is that different for my podcast because usually it's just me talking, responding to questions that have come in an email or things that I want to talk about. The biggest difference outside of having someone else on this with me right now is when you send me questions, sometimes I have time, week, 2 weeks more to sit and think and process and research them and look them up. This is just, we're just going to roll. So give me some grace if some of the answers I give are, well, I don't know about that. I'm really just, we're going to be spitballing. So this is going to be very live, very in the moment. I haven't seen any of the questions he's asking me. He's just bringing them and we're going to talk. And so if I say something overly horrible or heretical, I'll try to edit that out. Maybe I'll leave it in. I don't know. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be a good time. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Michael McGarrah. All right. Michael McGarrah.
Hello.
Welcome. You are the first ever guest on the Like Stars podcast. I feel like I should give you like an award or something.
Nah,
I don't
okay.
know. Michael, sorry. Who are you? Tell the literally tens of people listening who you are.
Sure. So Mike or Michael is fine.
Yeah.
Don't feel
You're not
bad.
offended if I call you Mike. All right.
Absolutely not. But yeah, I am a San Diego native, born and raised. Have been coming to Rise with my family, my wife Sarah and our 2 daughters, Alice and Anna, for about 2.5 years now.
Cool.
But yeah, I am an engineer by trade, and Sarah is a math teacher, high school.
And
math
everyone
teacher.
on this podcast will hear the engineer come out when you start asking questions.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm definitely a thinker, and I love Jesus. I love the Bible.
Sure.
But something that I've always been is a questioner, right? So someone where I'm like, yeah, I have faith, and like you've said in your your Rise to Life class, you know, it's that loyalty, it's that fealty to Christ, and I've definitely got that. But that doesn't erase the questions I have, and so
Yeah.
I love this podcast. It's great to be on it because I love digging into questions and hearing people's perspectives, and and like today was supposed to be, was getting lunch together. I don't see any fries or chips in front of me, but
yeah, that's
still getting
true.
to ask the questions.
I actually started a diet, so it's probably good for me. It's funny though, I was thinking like it actually is fitting that you are the first person to talk to live on this, because let's just say, for example, over the last month, if I've gotten 50 questions, 35 of them are for you. So I'm like, we might as well just talk.
Yeah.
But you know, when we get together and we just have lunch, a lot of times I think it's coming a lot of times from your own reading over the course of a few weeks. And you're like, the last time we talked, you were spending a lot of time, it looked like kind of like in 1st, 2nd Samuel, that kind of area, the Kings.
Yep.
And so the questions were, I don't want to say they were the same questions, but they were rooted in an area of scripture. But other times we've met and it was just random. So there's no agenda here. There's no, this is what we're going to talk about. It's
true.
whatever. And I already kind of told everybody earlier in the podcast that I haven't heard your questions. So that's different because as I mentioned, I'll usually spend some time thinking about them, if I'm doing a little research.
Yeah.
I got nothing. So I don't know, man. What do you?
We'll see.
And
And that's the thing. As you were correctly stated, it's during, my Bible reading, I'm like, oh, that's something that I've read so many times and have normally said, all right, I wonder about that, or I'll look into that, and never have. And so I always, now that I know you and I have this relationship, I just take note of it. Numbers chapter 22, verses 20 and 21 and 22. It seemed like God finally said yes to Balaam and said, hey, yeah, you can go with the men of Moab. But then that next verse, he then turns and says he's angry and blocks the way. And I wasn't sure if you had done any research into that, if the way of storytelling in the way that was written was, it said something in the Old Testament of that time, or if that
So why don't we do this? Like, I think, because you and I have had conversations, but the people listening might be like, what are you talking about? Can you give some context to the story for people listening?
Sure. So story is, there's this king of Moab who is afraid of the Israelites hearing about their great God.
Right.
So he reaches out to this prophet, Balaam, who I also do air quotes because his fealty seems to be in question, and says, hey, I want to pay you to curse the Israelites for me so that we can win in battle or whatnot.
Right.
And Balaam, prays, and God says, don't do it. And so then he says, sorry, I'm not going to do that. The guys go back to the king and tell him that, and the king's not happy. Comes back a second time, same thing. Comes back a third time, and I'm pretty sure it's the third time or the fourth. Balaam asks God again, and God says, okay, fine. If they're asking for you to go, then you can go with them in the morning. So then Balaam does in verse 21, but then in 22, and then it says, and then because the Lord was angry with him, and then I guess I should pull it up in my phone. He sends an angel of the Lord to block the way of him and his donkey. And I was just always curious, like, did God change his mind there? Of like, it seems interesting that he said, yeah, you can go, but then was angry because Balaam went with. So that's the first part of the question.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing about that whole story, that whole passage, is what is essentially an intermixing of cultures and religions.
Yeah.
And you're reading the Bible, which is the word of God, and you're seeing words like prophet and God's voice and things.
Yeah.
And it's almost like in your head, you want to immediately make all of these people like they're Christians.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I think that immediately comes to the surface is, who is Balaam a prophet of?
Right.
And there's just a vagueness to the entire story.
I had that as a question, actually. I was
Right.
like, I don't think there's anything that can give clarity to that, so I deleted it because I had already 3 pages worth. But like, was he a prophet of Yahweh?
Right.
Or was he? It just says prophet. Like,
So think of it this way. This is what makes reading the Old Testament, especially history books like Samuel, Kings, Chronicles.
yeah,
So I think I've mentioned this on a previous podcast, but when God speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai and gives the people the commandments, you and I have talked about this before.
Yeah.
He gives them this command that says, have no other gods before me. And it develops what became known as monotheism, one God. But what's confusing about that, we live many thousands of years after that. And as Christians, we are now, I guess you could say, looking back in history, and we believe there is only one God.
yeah,
But the command to only have or worship one God was not a statement that only one God exists. It was the belief that those other gods were not worthy of your worship, or
Yeah.
you weren't you were only supposed to honor and worship one God, which I've talked about on this podcast before, was unusual and different. So for someone to be a prophet was not a Jewish word. It's certainly not a Christian word. That word existed all over the world. If you were anyone other than a Jewish person at the time, to say you're a prophet just means that you dabble, I guess you would say, in trying to discern the will of the gods, plural. Mm-hmm. So there was no you wouldn't have said, I'm a prophet of this God or that God necessarily.
Yeah.
So, but you see that a little bit in the Old Testament, like the prophets of Baal.
Yep.
But the prophets of Baal, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't have also tried to consult other gods or deities for certain things. It just meant that most likely in that moment, Baal was sort of the chief deity. Mm-hmm. So you could actually be a prophet of Baal and still go and offer sacrifices to other gods, especially, again, as I've talked about, depending on what need you might have. So, there's the fertility gods, but then there's also gods of weather and crops and war and things. So Balaam, to be a prophet, we immediately think, oh, we're talking about, well, Samuel was a prophet. Well, Samuel was a very different kind of prophet, because what we see in the scriptures is Samuel was like wholeheartedly monotheistic. Yep. Like he was a prophet of Yahweh. Like that was it. There's no other. And Samuel was one of the first pictures we see of somebody being completely and utterly devoted to one God only. Balaam, who knows? So what's really weird and really tricky is, did Balaam understand that messages he was getting from Yahweh were coming from the one true God? Or did he just think, I'll go and, I know that these Israelites who are marching through this land worship this God called Yahweh, the God of burning bushes or whatever. I'll try to connect with that God or whatever.
Interesting.
You have no idea.
Yeah.
And the fact that the author doesn't tell us or give us any clarity is difficult for us today on this way distant side of history. But the original hearers would have understood that. Mm-hmm. There would have been prophets everywhere.
Yeah.
And even in Israel, and as you go on and you read into the kings and things, as you go on to read where even Jewish kings like Ahab would have multiple prophets in his court to different gods, which is like a problem. That was an issue. So Balaam is somewhere in the middle here. We don't know. He doesn't appear to be a prophet only of Yahweh, but he does appear to be someone that other kings recognized as someone who was a diviner, someone who was in touch with the gods. And at some point, my assumption is Balaam actually thinks he is trying to talk to or connect to the Israelites' God, even if he doesn't actually know who the Israelites' God might be, which that's so strange for us, right? Yeah. To even get our minds around that. Like, wait, so who did he think he was talking? Well,
interesting.
If you believe in thousands of gods, it's not strange. Yeah. It's strange to those of us that believe in one, and everything else Balaam was doing would have been nonsense until he went to come to talk to Yahweh. So that alone makes you approach this story very cautiously. Did Balaam get some kind of sign or omen? Did he hear the voice of the one true God saying the third time, yes, go ahead and do it? Yeah. Did Balaam do some kind of divination and draw lots or things, other stuff we've talked on this podcast?
Yeah.
And it wasn't really him hearing from God. It was just doing the ways he used to do. And thus, when he actually started out on his donkey, the real God was like, nope.
What the crap?
There's also the sense in which the bigger arc of the story is the way in which God uses Balaam to, I guess you'd almost say, sort of test. Because a big part of the whole story will be, who will the Israelites listen to? Will they listen to the one true God through his loyal prophets, or these random people like Balaam? There's so much to that story. And the reality is we can't know for sure. My gut would be God didn't change his mind. My gut would be Balaam. If I could go back in time and guess, I bet Balaam did what he normally did, which was, gods, do you want me to do this? I'm going to draw a stone out. If it's black, I'll do it. Okay, it's a black stone. And then he starts moving out, which was the common way of divination, which was weak and silly. And then the real one true God stepped into history and said, no further. That would be my gut feeling.
Yeah. Well, and thanks. That your answer to that question kind of answered another one that I had here, just about the fact of Balaam and him being a so-called prophet of many other gods, because then finally, the later chapter 23, it then says that he 23 verse 41 and then into chapter 24 verse 4, he's now at the high places of Baal, and that's where he then offers the sacrifices, and it ends up then blessing the Israelites. But I was like, how did God speak through him, our one true God, speak through this prophet who was offering on another God's altar?
Right.
I think it just goes to show that God can use anybody, kind of thing, and not that God was condoning his act in that way. It's just that as a prophet of the times, he was a prophet of many different gods. That's
and the word prophet is weird because, again, it's so difficult sometimes to read the scriptures through their own eyes and not your own eyes. We live with the basic idea that someone was only a prophet if the one true God spoke to them and they prophesied and something came true. Well, I believe that, but that's not how they thought.
Yeah.
You could be wrong many times and still be called a prophet. They probably were. I mean, you get into the book of Daniel and they're wrong all the time.
Yeah.
They were still called prophets.
Yeah.
And they did different words. Maybe Balaam wasn't called prophet by other people. Maybe he was magi or sorcerer or diviner or something like that. But yeah, he's a weird part of the story that shows the very early mixing and impact between this new thing God was doing with the culture of the time.
Yeah.
It's just now starting in those stories.
Yeah. Well, it gets even weirder, right? Like, we can't ignore the elephant in the room of the story that his donkey sees an invisible angel of the Lord, and then talks to him, right? And it's just like, that's the question there of like,
I would say that's always, if you're not familiar, you can, those of you listening or watching that aren't familiar, Balaam gets angry because his donkey won't move, and the donkey sees this angel. Mm-hmm. I would just say this, if there are children listening, there is obviously today in our culture, we have actually there's many things that change and shift, but calling someone an ass back then is the same thing as today. Like, donkeys were stupid animals. So I think that, I want to be careful how I say this. When I say author, I don't mean they made the story up. Mm-hmm. But whoever collated and put together that book clearly is doing something on purpose. Mm-hmm. Balaam, the prophet, is blind, and the ass can actually see it. Yeah. So the stupid one actually speaks to the one who claims to have knowledge. And all of Israel's interactions with pagan and sort of pagan prophets and seers and diviners, everyone, as I've talked about a lot on this podcast, who claimed to have wisdom, a prophet, I got knowledge from God, claimed to be wise, claimed to know what the gods wanted. Yeah. And here's Balaam setting out on this journey representing the will of the gods. And he can't go any further because the true God sends something the way, and Balaam can't see it. Yeah. A donkey can. Mm-hmm. So who's actually the donkey? Yeah. So I think there's obviously, to me, I think that the author is wanting you to...
There's a metaphor there.
He's calling Balaam the donkey.
Yeah.
He's saying you're more blind than a donkey. Yeah. Which, being a donkey was a bad thing. Yeah. So I think in that moment you're seeing that Balaam was not a hero of the story. Yeah. He represents something that the Israelites are supposed to be moving away from to find true wisdom in God, not in the things that Balaam did.
That's good. I like that.
Thank you. This is fun. This is very different than everything, because usually I'm just like talking right into a camera and I have like prearranged questions. I don't know what's coming.
You get some social interaction.
Yeah, it is. It's just not me
talking to yourself, talking to a
camera.
Talking
to myself. Yeah.
Moving on into some Samuel and Kings questions. 1 Samuel 13 verses 8 through 14 talk about Saul when they're about to go to battle and he is waiting for Samuel and doesn't show up in a timely manner. And so Saul's like, all right, let's do this. And he offers a sacrifice. Right. And Samuel's like, yeah, you made a big mistake. Mm-hmm. And because of that, here are the consequences. But then later on, when David's king, 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 25, the very end of the book, David goes and offers a sacrifice.
So in these two instances, again, you're working with Old Testament texts that can be hard to work through. What I would probably put forward would be, in the first instance, and then throughout, there is a clear and there's a clear expectation of roles that you're not supposed to cross.
Yeah.
And this comes up in the book of Hebrews a lot. And we did a whole thing on Melchizedek and things.
Yep.
And in that episode, I talked about how there was a role for the king, and it was not.
Yeah.
I almost used a word when scholars or historians talk about this stuff in the ancient world, they use the word cult. And it's hard because the word cult means something different for us today.
Yeah.
Back then, cult practices meant anything that you did that regarded this kind of worship. Cultic meant like offering sacrifices, things like that. It didn't mean like cults that, but I'll probably use a different word, but the place of the temple, of the sacrifices, of that kind of worship, the king was not supposed to do.
Right.
The king was not a priest.
Yep.
Melchizedek was different, and that's not this podcast. There was something unique about him that Jesus then fulfilled. But in Israel's governmental system that God set up, the king was not supposed to do this.
Yeah. So that's why it made sense where Saul's story is like, he definitely was wrong.
I think the challenge, there's two challenges. That doesn't mean, and again, you're talking about language.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that at the end of the story, when David, it says he offers the sacrifices, I'm not sure that it meant he literally grabbed the animal and killed it and burned it.
He had
or
them
it meant,
offered.
Yeah, because there's a moment when David brings the ark back into the city and offers sacrifices.
Yeah.
It's not implying that David was killing all those bulls. One person couldn't have done it anyway. It was implying that David had it done.
Yeah. Okay.
There's also something very personal about David's story of repenting for his own sin.
Yep.
So him offering sacrifices is speaking to David's own contrition and his own desire to make things right with God. Whereas the first story with Saul, it's Saul trying to manipulate things.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to go into battle without the God's will and wishes and blessing. That was common thought that everybody in the ancient world thought. You want the priest to get the God's blessing before you go. And so the Israelites are doing something similar, like waiting on God is we're going to not move because we trust God. And so the idea of trust is central to Saul's story and ultimately why he's rejected. He doesn't trust God.
Yeah.
So he was, rather than just wait and do things the right way and allow the priest to come and do it, the prophet Samuel, he does it himself.
Yeah.
And that starts the first step in a long line of kings who would be judged by whether or not they trusted God and did it his way or tried to do it themselves.
Yeah.
And every time a king says, I'm going to do it my own way, I'm going to finagle it, I'm going to twist it and try to make it my own thing, things get out of hand and go bad. And so right from the beginning, Samuel is trying to say, this is the precedent. You must, if you are the king, you must obey God in all things because you're leading the people in God's will, and this isn't God's will. So I think even though the language might look the same, both of them offered sacrifices, the circumstances, and I don't know that, just to be clear, I don't even know that I don't even know that Saul would have specifically killed the animals himself.
Gotcha.
But even being the one responsible to move the thing forward, not waiting for how it's supposed to be done. There's something happening there that is ultimately about trusting God.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Something that you said in that answer reminded me of one of the questions I have way down here on page 4. And so I'm just going to jump to it.
The fact that you have 4 pages is alone. Just so you guys know, this is. If some of you are watching or listening, and you're like, I don't know if I could ever I don't want to bother Pete with a question. Michael has 7 pages, and I'm not bothered.
I think I have 5.
Keep them coming. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No. So it says, I say, during the Tripping Hazard series, 1 week was about the point of praying. Was about the point of why do we pray if God already knows everything. And it was great, speaking on how God isn't a vending machine and prayer is more important about a heart transformation and the relationship being built. The reason why this came up is because you had said Saul was trying to, get God to do something for him. But just to confirm, prayer does have the ability to affect reality, as is seen in my own life when I pray, but also I believe Scripture supports that. For example, when Moses intercedes for the Israelites, often God turns away from his wrath. And in Amos 7, it appears that God changed his mind. I can pull that up if we want to. How do we resolve this, where God's in control, but our prayers have power to influence as well?
Sure. I actually had a great lunch with a guy a couple days ago. Brandon, his name is, and this came up. We talked about it for a while.
Yeah.
It was a really good question. It wasn't in the context of the Old Testament, but I think it's a good thing to talk about. Let me start by separating two things that you said because
Sure.
they're different. First, anywhere in the Old Testament, I'm not sure if it's in the New Testament or not, where it talks about God relenting from sending calamity or whatnot, I would put that in a separate category from just general why pray.
Yeah.
That is almost always like turning our hearts back to God, which is a very different thing than why pray.
Gotcha.
Like living in blatant sin and coming to a place of saying, you know what, I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to repent. God, I'm sorry. Then God backs up and says, okay, good. That's a very different thing than, for example, we're recording this in, it's late August 23, and there's some like terrible fires happening in Hawaii right now in Maui. And a couple of days ago we were talking about it, and it's like, well, should I pray that God stops the fires? Is he going to do it whether I pray or not? And if he's going to do it whether I pray it or not, why doesn't he just do it if he's good? And you get into all kinds of issues there. And you see some of it in the Old Testament. The question of whether he'll do it or not, whether he'll change his mind, often gets jumbled with the questions of, free will versus, God's sovereignty, and he can just do whatever he wants. And here's my basic answer to him when we talked about it. I'll kind of repeat it. I think that the story that you think you're living in determines how you answer that question. And what I mean by that is, and anyone that is listening to this at all, spent any time with me knows that one of the things I'm passionate about is helping us as Christians move away from what I think is a bad story, that the world is this broken place that you're stuck in, and Jesus came to help you escape it and get away from it. And I've done a whole podcast episode on what does it mean to be in the image of God, all these kinds of things. And I don't want to repeat it all here, but if your story is you're just living this 60 to 80 year life as some kind of test to get somebody somewhere else, then things like prayer are just like, I don't know, God is going to do what he's going to do. Who cares what I do? Things like that. If you understand, though, Genesis 1, that you were created in God's image from what I think is its true historical perspective, that human beings were created here for this earth. And not only that, we were given charge over it. So, and when I did the podcast on that, I'm not sure what episode it was. I think it was called Image is Everything. I compared it to like a CEO of a company, or maybe an owner of a company turning over to a CEO or someone like that, a chief operating officer, and saying, okay, you're in charge, take it. And in some ways, if you look at it through that story, what happens when the managers of the company need something from the owner? What happens when there's a need that's beyond them? Like we need a new building, or we need to know what our budget's going to be for next year. How, those kind of questions. Something catastrophic happened and we need someone to come in and step in here. Well, hey, you call the owner and you say, hey, we need this or that. In that time, in that moment, there's a partnership, a relationship between the owner and the people representing and working for the owner. They coexist together, and it doesn't mean the owner does everything all day. The owner has given responsibility to those working and taking care of the business. But there are times that those people need to turn to the owner, and the owner, it's his business. So of course he's going to want to step in. And I think what's interesting about prayer, when it's seen through that lens, I would almost create three distinct kind of categories. And one we already talked about, the sort of repenting or turning away from sin. There's also the kind of prayer that just is more about attuning my heart and getting, like, prayer in a relational sense of getting to know God. Both of those are super important. But then there's this thing that's often called, Christians call it intercessory prayer, praying for things that you want God to do. That's where this kind of rubber meets the road. Like, does this work? Does it matter? Should I bother? Why doesn't God just do it anyway? That's a really hard question if you don't see us as true image bearers. If we're just living on God's earth and he's in charge, well, it's your fault, God, fix it. And God's looking at us and saying, I turned it over to you. I want you to take care of it. If you want to involve me, the door is open. The door to my office is unlocked. You have my phone number. You're managing it. If you need me, come talk to me. And that changes the way you think about prayer, I think, because it's not like, well, I don't know, God's going to do whatever he's going to do. It's like, well, no, God is waiting for you to manage his world well. And part of you managing his world well is knowing when you need to bring the owner into it and say, hey, God, we need your help here. It doesn't mean that he's going to do it all the time. It doesn't mean you're guaranteed that he's going to do what you ask for, but it does mean if you never ask for his help, why would he ever intervene when he's turned it over to you and told you to do it? So intercessory prayer isn't like some mystical, weird thing. It's part of, I think, being image bearers. It's part of us managing his creation. And when there's something going on, we call upon God. We step and say, God, we need you now. Yeah. We need you, the owner, to step into this. We need something. We are natural. We need something supernatural to move here. And I believe in that. And I've seen it happen. I've seen God do those kind of things. And so, I believe in it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pete. No, and that was one of those questions that I wanted to get your perspective on, because I've been asked so many times by people in my life, because I'm dedicated to prayer. I see God work. Not only does it change my heart and my perspective, but he does miracles. And I've had people ask that, like, well, if God already can do it himself, then why pray? And how does that work? So
why doesn't he just do it?
I like that analogy that you've given.
And the danger is, if you're not careful, if you don't have a good answer for it, you leave God open to the charge he's not actually good.
Yeah.
If God is good and he loves us, why doesn't he just do it? And there's no good answer for that unless, let me back up. I think the only good answer to that is because he has turned it over to us and he is willing to step in when we ask him to, but he gave us the freedom to choose not to ask, because this is our world and we're in charge of running it.
Yeah. And an example of this next question is in 1 Kings chapter 1, 49 through 50. I always was curious when people, again, in the Old Testament, were fearful for their lives. Many times they ran to the tabernacle and grabbed at the horn of the altar, it says.
Right.
And I was always curious, in your studies, is there a symbolic reason for that? Or is it just, well, shoot, no one's going to kill me in the tent of God, like a respect thing?
No, there's so I can't quote it for you because I don't have my Bible in front of me, but yes, the Torah actually gives what were called places, sometimes cities of refuge.
Yeah.
So the temple was considered a place of refuge.
Got it. Okay.
Is there something to the fact that I can't spill blood in the holy place? Probably. I'm assuming that's connected, but there were other cities of refuges that weren't literally the temple. They were just places like, if you get here, you can't get revenge on you.
Until the high, and they have to stay there until the high priest dies.
Right. And essentially you're creating a scenario where somebody can step in and hopefully intercede or things on this.
Yeah.
It's also just such a different world to think of. People could get revenge on you for things that were like barely your fault. Like, your child comes over to my house, play with my child, and my roof collapses and kills your child. You can come and kill me. And like for me to be able to and go to a city of refuge and things like, what a crazy world. And that, again, we look at that like, where's God? That's everybody. That was every culture.
Yeah.
But other cultures didn't necessarily have the cities of refuge. So what you see, and I know I'm kind of changing the subject, but I think it's good as we study the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true that things in the Old Testament are not what they should be. The commands of God and the things he offers are not nearly to the extent that I know that God actually wanted to take it and ultimately does in Jesus and through us.
Yeah.
But they are a huge step up from the world around them. To have any way to stop the cycle of violence and revenge and things like that was different than the rest of the world. Just because that, you think about what a terrible problem that is.
Yeah.
If something happens and I wrong you and your response is to wrong me and you kill me, and then my brother's like, well, now I'm going to kill you, and then his brother's like, now I'm going to kill you, and it just cycles and cycles.
There's that, I'm terrible with history, but that family,
Hatfield and McCoys.
There you go. Yep.
Just cycles of violence. Yeah. And so even though we're not nearly where we should be, which is don't kill anybody, and actually, so we're starting in the Old Testament with, here are cities of refuge, here are places you can escape retribution. Eventually we get to, actually, I just want you to forgive. Which is where God was leading humanity, but they just were not there yet. And so the Old Testament we shouldn't be following the Old Testament. We follow the New Testament, but we can see what God is leading them slowly to.
Story.
And it's certainly not perfect, but it's something.
For sure. What's the purpose of including all of the intricate details in the Bible? Like, for example, the tabernacle, Solomon's house, the temple, exact donations and sacrifices by tribe. Since the Bible's, divinely inspired, I've always thought that there's a reason for everything included in the Bible. And I've struggled seeing the value in reading certain portions.
Oh, man, I feel like there are
Should we cut that one?
No. I don't know if I have a good answer, but it's fun. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
I feel like there are two parts to your question. Sure. That there's the question itself, and then there's the question about
my underlying assumption.
Divinely inspired. Yeah. So I think I can separate them and start with the first part and say this is a history book for these people.
Yeah.
So a history of who gave what matters years later. Well, did you contribute? Did your ancestors contribute? Who has a claim to this? Who has claim to that? You're also probably writing this. This is probably being written much later than it happened. Some scholars believe this was actually written down after all this stuff was destroyed.
Yeah.
So a record of what it looked like might have been necessary because it didn't exist anymore. This stuff could have been written down during the Babylonian captivity or even later with Nehemiah and Ezra.
Yeah.
So the details would matter if we're going to rebuild it. We know in Ezra they went to rebuild the temple, and the people who remember the first one cried because it was small.
Yeah.
So having a record of what it was supposed to look like might have sent them to that.
Interesting.
So my best guess would be these records were meant to preserve what it was supposed to be for future generations when they could rebuild it.
Okay.
And eventually they did start to rebuild it more. Herod went to a huge project to rebuild it. And I'm sure when Herod's majestic temple, that was actually still under construction when Jesus was there, but it was mostly done.
Yeah.
My assumption would be Herod brought in scholars who knew and had all those scrolls and said, okay, this is supposed to be 8 cubits. That's supposed to look like this. Yeah. And they would have designed the interior according to these standards. Wow. Now, when you say divinely inspired, well, I guess right off the bat, I would argue if that is what it was for, then that is divine inspiration because God wanted, when the temple, when it was going to be rebuilt a few hundred years later, he wanted it built right. Does that mean that a follower of Jesus living in 2023 should be reading the cubits and saying, well, since this is a divine inspired,
there's something for me today.
There must be, it must be an analogy. And the 9x9 cubit must somehow refer to the perfect square that must exist in heaven. And there must be this number of angels. And so 9 is September 9. The 9th day of September must be God's perfect. Shut up. No, that's not what divinely inspired means.
Yeah.
This was written for those people at that time.
Yeah.
I think you can read these stories and find meaning in the sense of what do they teach us? What do they explain to us? If something is meant to be prophetic or a prophecy about the future, okay, let's talk about it. But this stuff, don't get too wrapped up in those details.
Yeah.
It meant something for them. And I don't personally believe, although Christians disagree, I don't believe that God is going to rebuild a physical temple according to those standards. Although some people do, and that's okay.
Yeah.
We have differences of opinions. So I think it was for them, and that's enough.
Yeah.
Fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, that's good. In 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, it talks about David taking a census and where he was influenced to take the census from.
I see where you're going here.
And then in 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, it seems to have a different influence.
Right. So in both stories, David takes a census. In both stories, it's wrong.
Yep.
The difference is one of those stories tells us that Satan moved his heart. In the other story, it tells us that God moved his heart.
That's right.
Some people argue.
Seems like I'm not the first person to ask you that question.
It's a hard question.
Yeah.
I think somebody emailed it, and I just responded in email because it was like I didn't know about the podcast. Let me give you a couple of thoughts, and the first thing I would say is this: this is that's a tough thing. I mean, like I really dove into it for a while because I was really curious, and I didn't necessarily come away being like, okay, got it. I'm like, I don't know that anybody's going to get this. I will say, even reading the phrase Satan inspired is like a little bit, if I could use a really big academic word, anachronistic.
Totally know what that means.
Yeah, of course, everybody does. Anachronistic means like later in time. Like
Okay.
you're taking something you know now and reading back in time as if they knew it.
Oh,
yeah.
In prior questions I've asked you, you've told me about this, so I'll let you keep going for the people.
Well, so even the word Satan was not a personal, demonic fallen angel to them. The very concept that such a being exists shows up later in history. So if you look at the book of Job, that's often a very big misconception. People read Job like, oh, the devil and God. The Satan was in their language, the word Satan is not a personal name. It means adversary.
Yeah.
It could also refer to a lawyer who is on the accusatory side. So there's a prosecutor and defendant.
Yep.
Satan could be prosecutor. So they weren't, if you had read that in their culture, at their day, your thought wouldn't have been, this thing we call the devil rose up and got me to do it. Mm-hmm. You could have thought it. You could have thought it the same way you might have read that the same way you read the book of Job. Mm-hmm. There's some kind of opposer, some kind of accuser, some kind of being that's like, oh yeah, what about this? And even this is what's weird is, does God actually sort of use that being in some way? Mm-hmm. And that's where our theology about what we call the devil gets tricky and dicey. Now, I'm not saying I don't believe there's a devil. Jesus talked about that. I'm just saying in this context, when this was written, I'm not sure they would have looked at those two passages and said, well, wait a minute. One of them says God, and the other one says the devil. Yeah. I think they would have looked at both of them. And this is harsh. You ready? Yeah. I think they would have looked at both of those and ultimately attributed it to the work of God. Yeah. Now, some people even disagree with that. Some people believe that it's possible that one of those was written first. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously one of them was written first. They weren't written at the same time. One of those is maybe the one that says God did it was written first. And when the second one was recorded, they were like, wait, we can't attribute a plague to God. It must have been Satan that did this. What does that do to the way that we read the scriptures? That's a really hard question. Yeah. It's a very difficult thing to work through. Something that you and I have talked about, and I'm really reticent to say this without trying to give a bunch of clarifiers. We've talked about how even the word divinely inspired is dicey when you're talking about Old Testament history books, when you're talking about Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. As I mentioned to you before, and I don't know if I've said in this podcast or not, if you were to take a time capsule and go back and talk to a Jewish scholar living 2,000 years ago, and you would use the word inspired, I'm not sure they would have fully understood what you meant. Mm-hmm. They would not have understood the word inerrant. That wasn't a word that existed. Inerrancy or infallible, these words we apply to the Bible. But I would say this, they would have taken a scroll of First Chronicles and held it next to a scroll of Jubilees or 4 Enoch or the Wisdom of Solomon, and all been like, yep, it's all the writings, right? Mm-hmm. And some Jews would have been like, I don't accept any of it. A Sadducee would be like, nope, none of it's the word of God. Mm-hmm. I'll take Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's it. Yeah. Don't be quoting 1 Samuel at me. I don't know who wrote that. And then the Pharisees were like, no. We believe in the writings. We believe that those were inspired and we hold to them. And then different people would have been on different sides of the spectrum. But even the Pharisees, to say we believe this is the inspired writings, did they mean that there couldn't be any inconsistency or anything like that in the history books? Mm-hmm. And I this is tough. I don't have a specific answer. I'm just telling you what I know, what we kind of know about history. Yeah. I think that a Pharisee would have fought tooth and nail against any suggestion that the words in Isaiah weren't divinely inspired words from a prophet. Mm-hmm. I don't know they would have fought tooth and nail over First Chronicles. Yeah. They might have just been like, it's a history book. History is history. Yeah. The very expectation that you and I have for a history book to be, oh gosh, this is such a hard conversation, factual and they're like, oh, you're calling it a lie. No. Like when you open a history book, you have expectations of that history book. If you're in 9th grade history class and you open a history textbook that your teacher gave you, that's sponsored by the state, you expect everything in there to be exactly as it was written.
Yeah.
What you don't always think about is nobody wrote history books like that until what we would say sort of post-Enlightenment, the last probably 400 or 500 years. People like Francis Bacon and others who brought in new forms of education, the scientific revolution, all these things brought about, like, whoa, if you're going to write history, everything has to be exact. If you even in the days of like Jesus, which was much later than the book we're talking about, history books written at that time were often. Like Plutarch was a historian, and if you're listening and not watching, I just did that in quotes. He literally was a historian. But if you read Plutarch and his description of some of the famous people he wrote about, it's like, okay. Josephus is one of the primary historians we rely on in understanding the world of the first century. Yeah. He was a Jewish man who was captured by the Romans and eventually became a historian writing about the whole season of time. There are things in Josephus that were like, yeah, I don't know about that. You're probably, clearly biased, not completely accurate in everything. But nobody thinks Josephus is the word of God. Yeah. So I can say that and it's no big deal.
Yeah.
I can't say that necessarily about Chronicles. It creates a different problem.
Yeah.
I'm not completely sure where the line is. I'm not somebody that often uses the word inerrancy because if you look at Chronicles and compare it to 1 Kings, there are things that are clearly inaccuracies. There are things of even like how many soldiers were here, how big was this lake, things like that. I just don't think the people that were writing cared. 1st and 2nd Kings was theology. The point or the purpose of that book is to demonstrate the way in which bad leadership leads people astray. And that if we don't trust God and keep our eyes on him and do what he says, our nation's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
The point of that book is not to give precise details and numbers of everything that happened. And I think the purpose of this story, communicated in 2 different books, is that David was in charge. Yeah. Here's the part we didn't even touch on. Why was taking a census bad?
Right.
It doesn't even tell me. What's bad about counting? What are you talking? What's evil about that? We don't even know. We just know for some reason God said not to do it. And scholars will speculate. Maybe God wanted him to be fully trusting and taking a census was trying to rely on your own strength. There's possibilities, but it doesn't tell us. All it tells us is God did not want David to do that. He did it, and there were consequences, which is the whole point of both of those books. If we're not doing what God wants, it's going to go bad for us. Did God make it happen? Did God let somebody else intervene? Is there another spiritual force called the devil who God sort of takes his hand off and lets the devil do things? Are these things consequences of our own behavior? These are all great questions that we can dive into in other places, but they're not the point of that story.
Yeah, agreed.
And if you make them the point of the story, you miss a beautiful forest paying attention to pieces of bark on one tree.
Yeah.
Even though they're tough questions, I'm not trying to just smear past them.
No.
We don't have great answers to them, but it doesn't cause us to miss what these books are telling us.
Absolutely.
And why David was in the wrong to do it.
Yeah.
If you really pushed me, I think I would be inclined to say that given the whole of Scripture, it's probably more likely that God took his, and I'm using language to describe something I can't really describe. God took his protection away. God allowed things. Yeah. And when God allows things, everything, and that's why doesn't God do it? You don't even know what God is stopping.
That's true.
You don't know what tragedies and disasters God has held at bay.
Yeah.
And there could be a moment that God said, I'm going to let this happen because you did that.
Yeah.
Now, if you come to me, I'll take care of it and deal with it and stop it. But and that's kind of a story we see, even Paul picks it up in Romans. So much of our brokenness is a result of us rejecting God and him saying, fine, deal with your consequences.
Yeah.
If Satan is truly, and again, I'm now using the personal pronoun, if the thing we call the devil is indeed roaming the earth like a lion looking for people to devour, and the only thing keeping him from devouring me is God holding him at bay, saying no. And God says, fine, do what you want.
Yeah.
Then the natural outcourse will be problems. And if it is my disobedience to God that brings that about, now, I just want to say so many things because this can go so sideways so easily.
Yeah.
keep in mind, nothing that you're reading is written towards 21st century Christians. This was a story about a special group of people that God had a very special and specific relationship with, that God had a plan for because he wanted to do something through them for the rest of the world. And if they didn't follow his instructions, the plan fails. So God's treating of these people is not necessarily the way that God responds to all human beings. That's a categorical mistake in the way we read the Old Testament. Oh, look, God did this thing here. That's who God is. That's how God treats all people. No. God, and let's not forget this. If I borrow money to buy my house and I don't pay the bills, and somebody shows up at my house one day, bangs down the door and comes in and starts taking out my furniture and selling it. What is this? How dare you? Wait, hold on. If my stuff is getting repossessed, it's not because repo men are bad people who take everybody's stuff. They're not thieves. It's because I made an agreement with a bank that I would do something and they gave me something for an exchange. And I did not live up to my end of it. So it's not that these men who are taking my furniture and taking my car are evil or wicked. I can yell at them and call them thieves and be angry. You're stealing from me. But the reality is they're not. They're doing what my contract said they would do if I didn't follow up on it. Anyone that didn't sign that contract, anyone that didn't say, I want, God, I'm in this, I want this here, he's not repoing their stuff. That's a weird metaphor. Maybe not. And so when I read the Old Testament and I read these specific things God is doing with the Jewish people, if I read it and say that's who God is for everybody all the time, I'm missing the point that they signed a specific contract called a covenant with God. I didn't. I signed a different one. We call it a new or second one. The scholar Scott McKnight did his own translation of the New Testament, and he called it the Second Testament, which I love. It's not that it's different. It's something new. It's a second one. And in that one, the whole relationship is different. And it's now around Christ and what he's done and the power of the Holy Spirit. So it doesn't mean that God has changed. It means that he has now done something different with humans. And so I'm just very cautious in the way that I read some of these passages. Well, they're good questions. They're great questions to talk about and bring up. But I'm so cautious in the way that, what do they mean to me? How do I apply them? What do they mean about God? I have to see it through, these are ancient documents. Some of these history books weren't even necessarily considered inspired by their own people at the time, although I do now. And they're involving a special relationship with God and those people. And so it's going to look different than it might look today. I don't think that God sends plagues on people because they take censuses. Now, did he in that time? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe he was so, and this is hard for people, maybe God was so intent on that plan working because those people were the hope for the entire world, that being harsh with them at times was necessary, because if that didn't work, the rest of the world was going to suffer. So their disobedience, their failure to live up to what God was doing was going to cost everybody. And so at times he probably had to be difficult and harsh with them. But that's different now, and we're not in that same agreement. That was a long way around it, wasn't it?
It was good. No, and like you said, that's in my goal is to understand that, right? So I'm reading these, and I've got these little questions, and so I'll mark them down and ask you about them, or do some research. My end goal is trying to understand and apply it to my life, and saying, all right, God, I know who you are, and I want to know more. There's still more I'm searching out. And so that's where, if some of these answers are, hey, that's not the main part of the story, we're not really sure, that's a great answer for me. I don't need to know everything. I just don't want to leave things unasked and try and say, well, it's just faith, So
let me say something, because you're saying something that's bringing my mind around to a certain place. The danger with not talking about these hard questions is that people are still reading the Bible. And I told you I had a great conversation with someone this week. We're just asking some really hard questions, like these are easy compared to something that's me.
I left mine out there once.
Okay, great. And he made a comment about how one of his frustrations is he doesn't feel like Christians talk about this stuff. No one's talking about it from the stage. It's like, look, it's hard to talk about it from the stage because we don't have good answers. But here's what I would say. There's a difference between saying, I don't fully know what this means. I can't give you a perfect explanation for this. However, there are parts of that story that I want to make sure you are not coming away thinking, if I don't obey God, he's going to send a plague and kill my children. That's not what that story is teaching you. It has nothing to do with you. God is an evil, vile, moral monster.
Yeah.
That's not what you take away from that story. So if we don't talk about these things, if we don't sometimes address the really hard questions, then we actually could end up causing people to come away with really bad thoughts about these stories because no one's giving any clarity to them. Because I can't give a perfect answer, I don't give any answer, and then people are left thinking maybe God is a moral monster. Complete side note.
I think there's a book on that.
What's that?
I think there's a book on that one of my friends recommended I read.
Yeah.
Is God a moral monster?
Oh.
I'll have to look into that and let
Good, there you
know.
go.
He said it's really good. It's a catchy title to try and draw you in. It's not saying he is a moral monster.
Sure. Earlier or maybe where I forgot where we landed in Samuel, there's a moment where Saul is desperate to know and hear from God, but Samuel the prophet has died. And Saul can't get any prophets to hear from God. So he goes and finds a witch and asks her to call forth Saul's ghost. And the crazy thing of that story is Saul's ghost seems to come forward. And you're like, wait, hold on a second. Are there ghosts? Can dead people come back and talk to you through their spirit? Was it not really a ghost? Was it actually a demon? Well, the Bible says it was actually Samuel. And Samuel actually prophesies and gives Saul words from God.
Yeah. Just to clarify, you had said Saul's ghost. You meant Samuel's ghost.
Samuel's ghost, yeah.
Yep.
That's one of those stories that we never talk about because we're like, I don't know what to do with it. Do I believe in ghosts?
Quite something.
No, I do not. Do I believe that dead people can come back and give you messages? No, I don't. But, okay, you ready for this? Welcome to Like Stars. Is there some way that it's possible and that it might actually be feasible or possible for that to happen in God's created spiritual, physical world? Maybe.
Yeah.
However, while I can't fully answer that question, I can't sit here and say this is the absolute truth. I have strong opinions.
Yeah.
What I can tell you, though, I can give you an answer. I can give you the important answer.
Yeah.
The unimportant answer that I can't really give you is whether or not any of that is real or not real. The important answer is that God said, don't do it. Trust me, not spirits. Yeah. Because some of those spirits are definitely demons. They're trying to trick you. They're trying to lie to you. The other stuff, I don't know. Stay away from it. Don't do it. And so it's not a question of having all the information and knowing exactly what's true. It's a question of whether or not I'm trusting God. Because literally, you get into that stuff, you are in, like literally and metaphorically, you are in the dark. And when you're working in the dark, who's guiding you and how do you know if something is true or real? You don't. And so God says, stay away from it. So I'm like, well, could there be? Samuel, I don't know. That's weird. I don't think so. Maybe whatever. It was that one-time thing that God let it happen. I don't. It's all secondary to the fact that, and this is what's cool. I want to say it this way. Like, I don't want to be trite, but it doesn't matter because God told you not to do it.
Yeah.
And so you might be thinking, well, should I? What if it's real? It doesn't matter if it's real. It doesn't matter if it's fake. It doesn't matter if it's real. It doesn't matter if there's a side to it. It doesn't matter if it doesn't matter if it's 2% real and 98%. God said, don't do it. And if I'm a follower of Jesus and I'm following his ways, I'm staying away from it, period, because I trust God and he's the one that keeps me out of the dark.
Totally.
And so that to me is a good example of a story that we don't talk about because we don't have a good answer to. But I think sometimes we should talk about it because there's a part of that story we should really address, which is God says stay away from that stuff. Don't consult mediums. Don't go to seances. Don't go to Ouija boards. That stuff, it will destroy you. It will lead you astray. God specifically said, don't do it, come to me. And any other way you're going is idolatry and sin and wrong. So even though I can't give you a perfect answer to who Samuel's ghost was or wasn't, I can tell you that even the author of that book is clear that what Saul was doing was wrong. And Samuel's ghost says, this is wrong. Samuel's ghost is like, what are you doing? This is sin. Samuel's ghost says, this is why you are not going to be king. Because you're doing crap like this that God told you not to do. So let me go back. You go back and you're not going to be king anymore. And someone else that won't do this kind of stuff is going to lead the people. So
it's true.
That was the long way through. Well, Michael,
yeah,
Michaela, I don't know. No,
that one's off the table.
Not Michaela. I appreciate this. This was fun,
Same
man.
here.
I know we got through like 2 of 50.
It's all right.
But you know what?
I'm not going anywhere.
There's more burritos or chilies to be had in the future.
That's right.
So congratulations on being the first ever person. I'm like, maybe we'll do this again. I don't know.
We'll see if people like it.
Yeah,
you got to leave a comment.
Yes, you have to post something and let me know whether this was worth doing. But it was fun. So thanks, man. Appreciate it. For those of you that are watching, again, I really would appreciate some feedback. I always like it. If I don't get feedback, I feel like I'm just talking into the air. That's why this is kind of fun, because I'm not just like, is anybody listening to this? But yeah, comments, responses, emails, I love all of it. Unless you're emailing me to tell me that I suck. You don't have to do that one. You can leave that one alone.
Keep that to yourself.
Keep that. No, I don't. Whatever. All right. Thanks so much, and I guess we'll see you next time on the Like Stars podcast. Thanks, everybody.
You consume me and I'm burning alive when you're near